Chapter 18, Renewing the Sectional Struggle. This chapter will talk about 1848 to 1854 and kind of the consequences of the results of the Mexican-American War and what's going to happen to California. So again, reminder that all the images within this PowerPoint are in the public domain. This is chapter 18. And we are getting closer and closer to Civil War. Tensions are mounting. So we want to start off this chapter with this idea of finishing off the war with Mexico that we previously discussed in chapter 17. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, kind of sponsored by David Wilmot, this treaty officially ended the war, but initially a new and perilous round of political warfare. This initiated a new and perilous round of political warfare in the United States, because what to do with this new land. Now, California, of course, New Mexico, Arizona, all of this land here. California, you look at the possible new states, even Utah and Nevada, and part of Texas. But Texas, the decision of Texas being a slave state had already been determined. So Texas is going to remain a slave state, but what's going to happen to the areas of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California? The potential entrance of these states into the Union as free states is going to disrupt the balance that exists in the House of Representatives, or more specifically, the balance that exists between free and slave states in the United States Senate. Thus, legislatively, slavery could be abolished just through Congress. So this is something that the South is very, very aware of and wants to protect themselves against. So this Wilmot proviso flatly prohibits slavery in this newly acquired territory. And so that's going to be a source of great tension in the early part of the 1850s. And so in the last chapter, chapter 17, we talked about Abraham Lincoln, the congressman from Illinois in the House of Representatives, and how he asked about this spot resolution, the spot of which Mexico was attacked. Abraham Lincoln goes back to Illinois and starts to become very notorious for his ideas of popular sovereignty and this idea of self-determination. And so this is kind of a tricky concept that we want to talk about here. This idea of popular sovereignty, the popularity or the population, the people have the sovereignty or the power. And so the people have the right to determine, they themselves have the right to determine the future of a specific state. So it becomes evident that some people within the United States would like for states themselves to popularly declare or have a vote within the state on the future of slavery within that state. Now, Abraham Lincoln is very eloquent in kind of pointing out the fact that you don't want to have the freedom of people to choose with self-determination or popular sovereignty. Don't allow people the right to choose whether to keep another group of people in bondage, or don't allow people to have their freedoms to participate in a democratic process when ultimately that decision is to deny a whole other group of people their political rights. And so this is a theme that's going to develop into the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And this will be important getting into the end of the 1850s and the beginning of the 1860s and eventually the presidential race. Abraham Lincoln is going to run for United States Senate against Stephen Douglas. And these debates about whether or not Kansas and Nebraska should be able to determine by popular vote whether they are slave or free states becomes the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And so we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit more later. but just wanted to bring that up at this point in chapter 18. On page 379 in your textbook, the author starts to discuss the presidential campaign of 1848. The 1848 campaign in which former General Zachary Taylor of the Mexican War fame, in this very famous cartoon, is sitting upon Mexican skulls, and that he is becoming president on behalf of his victories in the Mexican War. But read about, on page 379, read about the election. There's some electoral college results in the bottom of page 379 on the right-hand column. So as the presidential campaign occurs, and eventually Zachary Taylor becomes president in 1848, or at least he gets elected in 1848. Gold is discovered as well in 1848, and it's discovered just 9 days before the war's end. Now, there's still speculation as to whether or not there was huge speculation that gold did exist. Did the military in fact know? Did the government know that gold was there? But Sutter's discovery of gold in 1848 allowed for the publication to occur, and so this is Sutter and his discovery of gold, of course, Sutter's Mill. This allowed for the newspapers on the East Coast to publish that there's gold in them hills, there hills. And so you look at the Northern California gold fields, the Sierra Nevada gold fields, and of course this then prompts the huge voyage to California, and what are known as the California 1849ers. And so kind of the port of entry continued to be San Francisco, and so you have the San Francisco 1849ers. And now this is going to lead to a great population boom, a great population migration out to the Wild West, leading then to, as these new territories, basically these new territories that the United States has gotten during the war with Mexico, as population in those territories increases, they become eligible to become states. As these territories become eligible to become states, then the argument will be, are they going to be free or slave states? Now, as California becomes more and more popular in population, as California becomes wealthier because of gold, there is a real need to make sure California stays linked to the United States. There's a fear almost that California could succeed as a country in and of itself, because there is no real connection to the United States. And so there's talk immediately of a transcontinental railroad. And this talk occurs in your textbook on page 405. But this transcontinental railroad could connect, conceivably, California to Chicago, or connect California maybe down to New Orleans. And of course, then there's an argument between the North and the South, which region would benefit the most. Well, both regions would benefit greatly from this connection. There is a Gadsden Purchase that occurs. This Gadsden Purchase occurs in this area right down here. If you know anything about the geography of the Southwest, this region down here is very mountainous and desert, and so you needed to purchase this Gadsden region, this Gadsden Purchase, in order to even make a railroad possible. The Gadsden Purchase does make a railroad possible from California down to connect California maybe to Texas, or even to Louisiana, to Mississippi. Now, there are senators, in particular Stephen Douglas from Chicago, from Illinois, who is extremely interested in connecting California up through Utah and even through Nebraska to Chicago. So there is going to be some political bargaining that's going to occur between Stephen Douglas and the South. If the South gives up their their claim on the railroad, and the North gets the railroad, Stephen Douglas will be the champion of what is called popular sovereignty. So Stephen Douglas is going to argue that Nebraska and Kansas, as they become states or eligible to become states, should be able to vote on whether or not slavery exists. When this occurs, then the southern region could possibly, despite this Missouri Compromise that we talked about several chapters ago, Missouri Compromise says that because you have this 3630, this line here, that everything north of 3630 will automatically be free. Everything south is slave. So it should not even be up for discussion. Is Kansas a free state or a slave state? Well, Stephen Douglas, because he gets the railroad, says that, or argues that Kansas and Nebraska should have the right to have popular sovereignty and determine self-determination, determine whether slavery exists in their states. And so the South is going to side with Stephen Douglas because they give up their railroad. So the long-term effects are Kansas and Nebraska have votes. They actually do vote then eventually to not have slavery. That then increases the free states representation in the United States Senate, and the North also gets the railroad. The railroad does not actually get built until after the Civil War, or at least not completed until after the Civil War. So let's take a look at this map, and it can't be underestimated how important this map is. This map is a map of the United States prior to the United States war with Mexico. So this region here does not count when you look at these states, the southern states, the slave states. And during on this map you have 16 in the north and you have 16 in the south. And this is important because of legislative proportionality. When the U.S. Senate has 16 and 16, then you have a deadlock, and so there can be no legislation concerning slavery or abolishing slavery. But when you look at future unorganized territory, this unorganized territory, when you have potentially this line that is drawn, this 3630, let's put it in this different color. When you have this 3630, the South starts to worry about all of this potential change to the numbers. How many more is the North going to get in the United States Senate? Well, then when you add Texas, Texas becomes a state. Does the South gain numbers? If the South gains numbers, then slavery is safe. So the abolitionists up north don't want the South to gain numbers. So this is going to present serious political issues. So it's something that cannot be underestimated. Hopefully you can grasp some of that argument. So when we get into the Compromise of 1850, this Compromise of 1850 is about California. Is California going to come in as a free state? When California comes in as a free state, does that tip the legislative balance between slave states and free states? And what's going to eventually happen to New Mexico? What's going to eventually happen to Utah? And so we know that prior to the Compromise of 1850, we did have the Compromise of 1820 that said 3630 is the line. So is this Compromise of 1850 going to replace the Compromise of 1820 or the 3630 line? And so that's the big question. California is admitted as a free state. So let's take a look here. California is admitted as a free state. The disputed territory by Texas and New Mexico is surrendered to New Mexico, abolition of slave trade, but not slavery in the District of Columbia. So that's concession. These are concessions to the North. And even when you look at this, can you imagine you can't have slave trade in Washington, D.C., but you can still have slavery. So they did not abolish slavery, but they abolished slave trade. Those are concessions to the North. Now, what did the South get? So now you look at what did the South get. So the South, New Mexico and Utah, are open to popular sovereignty. So that means that they don't become automatically slave states, but New Mexico and Utah have the option to vote on whether or not they are slave or free territory when they become states. Texas is given $10 million in compensation for the land that they lost to New Mexico. So when they lost this land to New Mexico, they are given $10 million in compensation. And then this becomes very, very polarizing here, this stringent enforcement of fugitive slave law. The South is very upset about the fact that when slaves escape to the North, there's not much done in returning them to the South. There was a fugitive slave law in place, but it was kind of ignored, and so the Compromise of 1850 says that a more stringent enforcement of the fugitive law must take effect. We'll look a little bit more at that. And so the Fugitive Slave Law was what many northern abolitionists called an abomination, this bloodhound bill, this man-stealing law. And so let's take a look that in the North, a fleeing slave cannot testify on their own behalf. A fleeing slave that is caught is denied a jury trial, and the federal commissioner who handled the case of fugitive would receive $5 if the runaway were freed and $10 if not. So there's all kinds of financial incentives to be maybe a little bit corrupt, and there is no legal recourse for these slaves. And so prior to this more stringent enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law, many slaves that were trying to escape could just escape into northern free territory, and they found many friends. But when this more stringent enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law occurs, many slaves feel like they must escape all the way north into Canada. So because these slaves feel like they need to escape to Canada, then that brings a more important emphasis on Harriet Tubman and other abolitionists' efforts in their Underground Railroad and trying to get these slaves not just across the river into Ohio or not just into Pennsylvania, but you got to get all the way up into Canada to have true freedom. So as you can tell, this chapter is bringing us closer and closer to the Civil War. Stephen Douglas is his scheme to bring Kansas and Nebraska in as potential slave states flatly contradicts the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and of course Abraham Lincoln is going to eloquently figure out a way to argue against this, but then we just have this slippery slope to the Civil War. And henceforth the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, previously enforced in the North only half-heartedly, was a dead letter. The Kansas-Nebraska Act wrecked two compromises, 1820 and that of 1850 indirectly. So the compromises that occurred, saying that you can't have slaves north of the 3630 line, that was the Compromise of 1820, and then the Compromise of 1850, saying that California is a free state, or whatever certain states in the future are free states. Eventually, when you have popular sovereignty, any state at any time could vote whether or not slavery would be legal or not. Thus, this heightens tensions between the abolitionists and the South, but it also kind of wrecks these compromises of the past. It's a slippery slope, Civil War, and we're getting closer and closer. Remember that this is 1850, Civil War begins in 1860. That concludes Chapter 18 PowerPoint. Please read through the chapter, and hopefully this will act as a supplement to explain certain things, point out and emphasize certain things within the chapter. If you have any questions, please email or give me a call. And this concludes Chapter 18 PowerPoint.